19-year-old Marines hit the black sand of Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, and their boots sank 6 inches with every step, like running through flour while men shot at them. Over the next 36 days, nearly 7,000 of them died, and another 19,000 were wounded, more American casualties than any battle in Marine Corps history. But the number that mattered wasn't how many got hit, it was how. The Japanese had built a defense with one goal, not to stop the landing, to make sure every survivor carried the island home in his body. The ash gave them nothing. On Guadalcanal and Tarawa, Marines could dig a foxhole and get real dirt between themselves and a mortar burst. On Iwo Jima, the volcanic sand collapsed as fast as they shoveled it, so most men never got a hole deeper than their knees before the next barrage found them. Combat correspondents who landed that first morning watched entire platoons get pinned in the open with nothing but seashells and loose ash for cover. And when the Japanese guns on Suribachi opened up, they walked their fire down the beach like a broom. The wounds that came out of that first afternoon were not clean, not even close. A mortar shell bursting in soft sand doesn't just kill the man it lands on. It throws a low spray of jagged steel and pulverized rock waist-high across everyone nearby. A Navy corpsman was soon treating a version of trauma most of them had never trained for. Men arrived at the aid stations with their intestines pushed outside the body wall, held in place with a bandage and a prayer until a surgeon could get to them. Others came in with a leg gone below the knee, the wound already packed with black sand that had to be picked out grain by grain before anyone could even talk about infection. One combat medic, working a shell hole on the western side of the island, later described the pattern that repeated for weeks. Splintered compound fractures, gunshot wounds, and worst of all, the men torn open by artillery and mortar fragments, arriving faster than the aid station could triage them. Nobody was safe behind the front line either. There was no behind. That same medic was holding a bottle of plasma 6 inches above a dying Marine's arm when a mortar round exploded nearby, showered the shell hole with shrapnel, shattered the bottle in his hand, and very nearly took off the tip of his own index finger. The blast concussion flipped him onto his back and tore his helmet off, and a second, smaller piece of hot steel opened his scalp before he even understood what had happened. He kept working. Nobody told him to stop. Sergeant Joel Deering took shrapnel across his cheek and leg in one of the same barrages, wounds that earned him a Purple Heart and a slow recovery before he chose to rejoin his unit rather than go home. Multiply that decision by thousands, because the wounded, who could still walk, usually did, since every rifle mattered and every hospital tent was already full. Getting a wounded man off that beach was its own battle. Landing craft could reach the shore for the first 9 days. Then the surf got too rough, and amphibian trucks, called DUKWs, took over the job of carrying casualties out to hospital ships waiting 2,000 yards offshore. Some men made that ride with a chest wound sealed by nothing more than a piece of cellophane and a corpsman's flat hand, pressed down hard enough to keep the lung from collapsing on the crossing. Bulldozers fought to cut usable roads through the ash so jeep ambulances could reach the aid stations, and Japanese gunners kept finding those roads and cratering them again, which meant a man with a shattered pelvis or a spinal injury sometimes spent an extra hour being hand-carried over broken ground before a vehicle could take him the rest of the way. That delay had its own cost. Wounds packed with volcanic grit and left too long before a surgeon could clean them turned septic fast in the heat, and doctors on the hospital ships treated a steady stream of gas gangrene in wounds that would have stayed simple if they'd reached an operating table 2 hours sooner. Others came off the line with burst eardrums and no visible wound at all, deafened by a shell that landed close enough to concuss without killing. Men who spent the rest of the battle reading lips and hand signals because their ears never fully recovered. Once Marines pushed off the beach toward Mount Suribachi, the fighting moved underground. and underground fighting produces its own catalogue of injuries. The Japanese had carved 11 miles of tunnels into the island's rock, connecting pillboxes and bunkers, so that a position Marines thought they'd cleared could open fire again from a hole nobody knew existed. Clearing those bunkers meant flamethrowers and satchel charges at close range, and close-range demolition work has a brutal cost of its own. Flamethrower operators absorbed backflash burns to their hands, forearms and faces when fuel ignited too close, and men caught at the mouth of a bunker during a satchel charge detonation came away with blast lung and burst eardrums even when the shrapnel missed them entirely. White phosphorus, used to force defenders out of caves, burned through cloth and kept burning once it touched skin. A wound that Navy surgeons had to keep debriding for days because the chemical didn't stop on contact the way ordinary fire did. Marine Chuck Lindbergh and the demolition men working near Suribachi's base spent their days crawling within a few yards of gun ports before they could even use a flamethrower, since the weapon's range was short enough that a man had to be close enough to be seen before he could fire it. A pillbox that hadn't been silenced could put a round through a flamethrower operator's fuel tank, and Marines watched more than one man go up in his own weapon's fuel when a lucky shot hit the tank on his back before he'd even pulled the trigger. Woody Williams, a demolition sergeant with the 3rd Marine Division, spent 4 hours alone destroying 7 Japanese pillboxes with a flamethrower on February 23rd, dodging rifle fire at a range close enough to touch the gun ports he was burning out, and walked away with the Medal of Honor and the kind of luck that most flamethrower men on that island never got. 23-year-old Navy corpsman John Willis was treating a wounded Marine in a shell hole near the front when a Japanese grenade landed beside them. He picked it up and threw it back before it could go off. Then another landed. He threw that one back too, 8 times. On the 9th, there was no time left. It killed Willis and the man he was trying to save. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, and his widow received it that December for a son who would never meet his father. Snipers turned the ridgelines north of Suribachi into a shooting gallery, and head and neck wounds from single rifle rounds became common enough that corpsmen learned to recognize the sound of a hit before they even saw the man go down. A sniper working from a spider hole barely wider than a man's shoulders could put 3 or 4 Marines down before anyone pinpointed his position, because the firing port sat inches above the ash and the muzzle flash vanished into the glare off the sand. Machine gun crews dug into reverse slope positions, raked advancing squads across the torso and legs, wounds that were survivable only if a corpsman reached the man inside a few critical minutes, because a hit artery in that terrain meant bleeding out before help could crawl close enough. Point-blank encounters underground produced a different kind of casualty than the open beach did. Marines clearing tunnels sometimes turned a corner and found a Japanese soldier 3 feet away in the dark, close enough that a rifle was useless, and the fight came down to a knife, a bayonet, or a fist. And men came out of those tunnels with stab wounds and broken hands that never made it into any official tally of shrapnel and bullets. Others were caught by booby-trapped entrances rigged with grenades, losing fingers or an eye to a tripwire nobody saw in the low light. Cave mouths collapsed under demolition charges, with Marines still working near the entrance, burying some alive under rock and forcing corpsmen to dig men out with their bare hands before they could even begin treating whatever injury the collapse had caused. 3 areas north of Suribachi earned their own name from the men who fought through them. Marines called it the Meat Grinder, a stretch of high ground built around Hill 382, the amphitheatre, and a rock formation nicknamed Turkey Knob, where nearly 850 Marines died, taking a position most maps show as a few hundred yards of volcanic rock. The wounds there came from every direction at once, because the Japanese had zeroed their own defensive lines with mortars and would drop rounds onto ground they'd already lost, rather than let Marines hold it. Men who'd survived a bunker assault and thought they were safe behind the new line got hit by their own captured ground an hour later. Safety was an illusion out there. tanks supporting the advance through the meat grinder hit mines that blew tracks and sent crewmen out through the hatches with crush injuries and burns. And more than one Marine walking beside a tank for cover was hurt by the same blast that disabled the vehicle he was using as a shield. Litter bearers and corpsmen paid a casualty rate that outstripped almost every other job on the island, because carrying a wounded man meant standing upright in terrain built entirely to punish anyone who stood upright. Pharmacist's mate Byron Dairy, who'd already earned a Silver Star for bravery at Normandy the year before, spent his last hours on Iwo Jima running back onto the beach again and again to recover medical supplies scattered by shell fire, until enemy fire killed him mid-rescue. By the end of the battle, medical casualties alone topped 700, with nearly 200 of those men killed while trying to save someone else. Pharmacist's mate Herman Trevor was attached to a mortar platoon when it took a direct hit that put 4 Marines down at once. He ran into the open to reach them, tied off a tourniquet on a man who'd lost a leg, worked hemorrhage and shock on 2 more, and then ran 75 yards through fire just to find a litter team, because none of the 4 could wait for a lull that wasn't coming. Multiply Trevor's afternoon by every mortar platoon on the island, and it starts to explain why 19,000 wounded is not a single kind of casualty. It's thousands of versions of that same 75-yard run, made by men who weren't required to make it, and made it anyway. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone had already survived Guadalcanal and earned the Medal of Honor there, the kind of record that could have kept him stateside selling war bonds for the rest of the war. He asked to go back anyway. Nobody made him. On the morning of February 19th, hours after landing on Red Beach, Basilone destroyed an enemy blockhouse single-handed and guided a Marine tank out of a minefield under direct fire. Later that same morning, a mortar round found him. Accounts differ on whether shrapnel or machine gun fire struck first. Either way, the wounds were to his neck, his groin, and his arm. They killed him almost instantly, on the same black sand he'd landed on less than 2 hours before. The 4th Marine Division alone recorded assault casualties that ran close to 1/3 of everyone who landed under its flag, a ratio that meant a rifle squad could go from 13 men to 9 or 10 inside a single week, without anyone in it being killed outright. Replacements arrived by boat in the middle of the battle. Green troops handed a rifle and pointed toward the front line within hours of landing. And some of the worst wound patterns on the island came from men who hadn't yet learned to read the ground, to know which depression in the ash was cover and which was just a shallow grave waiting to happen. Inside the division hospital, a low tent dug into the hillside for cover, a Time magazine correspondent spent one night in March watching what 36 days of fighting looked like once the shooting stopped for a given man. A Marine captain lay under the operating lamps with a machine gun wound. A corpsman with severe abdominal wounds died quietly, while the correspondent stood beside his cot, his breathing loud, and then, without warning, gone. Nearby, a heavy-set Marine fought to keep breathing after a hit artery, the pharmacist's mate at his side naming the wound out loud because there was nothing left to do but watch and hope. Some of the men in that tent had what the staff called light wounds, a broken arm, a broken leg, and they would live to be evacuated within days. Others, despite skilled hands working over them for hours, did not. Living conditions on the island produced their own casualties, without a single shot being fired. Marines went days without changing socks, in ash that held rainwater like a sponge, and medical logs from the battle recorded a steady stream of men pulled off the line with feet swollen and split from immersion, unable to walk until they'd spent days off their feet in the rear. Dysentery moved through units, drinking from whatever water source they could reach, adding sick call lines to aid stations already buried in combat wounded. None of it made for a dramatic photograph, but it filled cots just the same. And it meant a rifle company could lose 1/3 of its strength to something other than a Japanese weapon. Not every wound on Iwo Jima came from steel. Nearly 2,600 men were pulled off the line with what the Marine Corps recorded as battle fatigue, a wound with no bandage, caused by 5 weeks of a barrage that never fully stopped, day or night, and a defense that could open fire from ground already declared secure. Some of those men went back to their units after a few days of rest behind the lines. Some never fully came back from it at all. By the time the island was declared secure on March 26th, the American landing force had suffered over 24,000 total casualties against roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders, the only battle of the entire Pacific War where American losses outnumbered the enemy's. Nearly 7,000 Marines and sailors were dead. Another 19,000 carried a wound home or didn't survive the ones that looked survivable at the time. Every man in that second number had his own version of the story this video just told. An ash-filled leg wound, a burn that kept spreading after the fire went out, a hit that took a friend instead of him by 18 inches, and pure chance. The men who lived through it carried the accounting home with them. Field hospitals and stateside naval hospitals processed thousands of amputees, burn cases, and men with fragments still too close to a major artery to safely remove. Pieces of Iwo Jima, some of them, carried in their bodies for the rest of their lives. Veterans' hospital records from the years after the war show Iwo Jima Marines returning again and again for skin grafts, for nerve damage that never fully resolved, for hearing that never came back after a shell went off too close. The battle didn't end on March 26th for most of the men who fought it. It just changed address, from a volcanic island to an operating table, and for some of them, to years of therapy, for a war that kept replaying itself long after the black sand was an ocean away. Iwo Jima secured an airfield that would go on to save the lives of thousands of B-29 crews forced to make emergency landings on their way back from bombing runs over Japan. More men saved in the end than were lost taking the island in the first place. That's the number military planners point to when they're asked whether it was worth it. It's a real number, and it's true, but it was never going to feel that way to the men lying in that hillside tent, or to the mother in Raritan, New Jersey, who got a telegram instead of her son. Was an island worth that many bodies and that many decades of scar tissue? Historians still argue over whether Iwo Jima needed to be taken at all, whether a smaller force, a different plan, could have bought the same airfield for a lighter bill. Nobody who fought there got to answer that question in the moment. They only got to answer the one in front of them, over and over for 36 days. Hold the ground, help the man next to you, and if a piece of the island had to go home inside your own body, carry it and keep moving. Most of them did exactly that. The ones who didn't are still named on a wall in Honolulu and on headstones from Raritan, New Jersey, to towns most Americans have never heard of. Each one a man who was whole on February 19th and wasn't by the time it counted. The men who survived it spent the rest of their lives answering that question every way except out loud.